Good afternoon and salam. I am Miriam Afalabi, a member of the MACFEST team. Welcome to MACFEST 2022. This afternoon, we are thrilled to host an exciting discussion about two amazing Muslim women and their travels to Europe in the earlier 20th century. This will be presented by Dr. Mahmudul Hasan, who has studied and taught English and post-colonial literature at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. He earned a PhD in post-colonial comparative literature at the University of Portsmouth, United Kingdom, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Heidelberg, Germany. He is currently with the Department of English Language and Literature at International Islamic University of Malaysia. He has published extensively with the Asiatic Society of Bangladesh, Braille, Orient's Black Swan, Routledge, Sage, Welly Blackwell, and other presses. Some of his recent published works have been on Bangladeshi literature in English. He is the author of Islamic Perspectives on 20th Century English Literature. His co-edited books include Bangladeshi Literature in English, a critical anthology, a feminist foremother, critical essays on Rokia Sakhawat Hussain, and Displays and Forgotten, Memoirs of Refugees. Before I hand over to Dr. Hassan, I would like to request our audience to please follow MACFEST on our social media and spread news about the festival using the hashtag #SpreadHoneyNotHate. And as most of our events are free, we dearly welcome donations. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for this generous introduction. And hello and salam to all of you. It may sound like a truism to say thank you to the organizers and those who have made time to listen to my presentation. But I feel really grateful to MACFEST for offering me this space to talk about two amazing Muslim travel writers and two Muslim women travel writers. And I'm truly honored that all of you have shown interest and come on to attend this talk. I'll try to hold your interest. It's a long session. I will be speaking for about 45 minutes. I hope you will not be disappointed at the end. I'll be discussing two Muslim women who traveled to London in the early 20th century, Atiya Fyzee from British India and Zeyneb Hanoum from Turkey. I'll first introduce them and discuss the production of their travel narratives. In order to differentiate Atiya Fyzee and Zeyneb Hanoum from their sisters, who are also writers, I will use their first names instead of their surname. Both began their journeys in 1906 in the early 20th century. Atiya lived in England and Germany from 1906 to 7. She had to curtail her stay in England because of her health, but Zeyneb stayed longer in Europe. She lived in Europe from 1906 to 1912. And she lived in France, Italy, Switzerland, Spain, and England. One common place that both of them traveled extensively is London, and my presentation today is their representation of London and Londoners. Currently, roughly 15% of the London population are Muslim. That means more than 1 million Muslims in London alone. But we are talking about early 20th century when Atiya and Zeynep visited London. And at that time, according to Shibon Lambert-Hurley, Muslim population in Britain was roughly 10,000. So we are talking about a different demographic condition than what is today. And at that time, the preferred mode of long distance travel was by the sea, because air transportation began to be widely used on a commercial basis only in the 1950s and 60s. That is to say, both Atiya and Zeynep traveled to Britain by sea. Atiya had two other sisters. Zahra was older than her, and Nazli is her younger sister. These three sisters had a modern education, and all of them visited Europe. So this tells us about their family background. They came from a privileged family background. And all these three sisters were involved in establishing Anjuman-e-Khawatin-e-Islam in Aligarh, that was established in 1914. Those who are familiar with South Asian history and culture, you know the significance of Anjuman-e-Khawatin-e-Islam in terms of women's advancement in British India. And all three sisters wrote books and contributed to different periodicals. It's actually tempting to compare the Fyzee sisters with the children of the Stephen family in London, especially Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. Children of both Fyzee and Stephen families were involved in writing and publishing. So it's quite intriguing that there are similarities between these two families. And in one of my writing, I actually discuss these two families. And Fyzee family was a branch of the illustrious Taibzi clan. So Fyzee is a branch of the Taibzis, and the Taibzis actually moved from Gujarat and settled in Bombay in British India. And they were hugely influential economically and politically. And they actively participated in founding the Indian National Congress that started its journey from Bombay in 1885. And interestingly, Atiya's maternal great uncle Badruddin Taibzi was the third president of the Congress. And he was also the first Indian to be called to the bar. So all these tells us about the illustrious family background of Atiya. And another interesting piece of information about Atiya is that she is known for her familiarity with two of the most influential 20th century South Asian intellectuals. One is Muhammad Shibli Nomani, the other one is Muhammad Iqbal. And Atiya talks about Muhammad Iqbal extensively in her book. Atiya was an unconventional and unorthodox woman in more than one sense. At a time when female education was discouraged or restricted to the home, she made a transcontinental trip for educational purposes at the age of 29 and unmarried. According to Gerald and Forbes, at that time, marriages could be arranged and performed without any age restriction. For example, Atiya's sister Nazli was married at 12 to a much older man to be his second wife. And earlier in 1883, Rabindranath Tagore married Mrinalini Devi when he was 22 years old and his wife was only 9 years old. So this tells us about the society at that time, that early marriage was very common. But in Atiya's case, it was totally different. She got married at the age of 35, whereas the average age of marriage for women at that time was 10 to 12. And she married the writer and artist Samuel Rahamin, who was of Jewish origin. While most husbands were much older than their wives at that time, and still now, Samuel was younger than Atiya by 3 years, and he converted to Islam before marrying Atiya. So all this tells us about Atiya's personality. She was a kind of unconventional and an iconoclast. Now I will talk about Atiya's book, where she describes her London experiences. I just want to give your background. Among Muslims in British India at that time, Syed Mumtaz Ali and his wife Muhammadi Begum were pioneers in advancing women's rights. They founded the Lahore-based weekly newspaper called Tahzib-e-Niswan in 1898, and Muhammadi Begum was its editor. And she had the renown of influencing and supporting many women writers, including Atiya. While Atiya was in London, Muhammadi Begum persuaded Atiya to record her experiences and shared those with the readers of Tahzibun Niswan. During her stay in London, Atiya sent regular roznamcha or diary entries to her sisters, Zahra and Nazli. Zahra did the initial editorial work and submitted those to Muhammadi Begum, who prepared them for publication. Thus, Atiya's diaries first appeared periodically in Tahzibun Niswan. They were later published in book form in 1921 as Zamana-i-Tahsil. Shibon Lambert Harley and Shunil Sharma translated the book under the title of A Time of Education and included it in their work titled Atiya's Journeys, a Muslim woman from colonial Bombay to Edwardian Britain. Like Atiya in India, Zeyneb Hanoum in Turkey hailed from an elite family background. Her father, Mehmed Nur Bey, was Sultan Abdul Hamid's foreign secretary. Nur Bey's father was a French nobleman who had converted to Islam when in the service of the Sultan. He lived thereafter as an Ottoman and Muslim under the name of Rashid Bey. Like Fyzee sisters, Zahra, Atiya, and Nazli, Zeyneb and her sister Malak received superior education at home and developed their multilingual credentials. Zeyneb and Malak received education from Western governances and spoke 5 European languages in addition to Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. That means Zeyneb and Malak actually spoke 8 languages. 5 European and Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Interestingly, in London, an English woman was amazed by Zeynep's proficiency in French and imagined that Zeynep was a French woman. In Italy, during her trip to Venice, in the train journey, Zeynep undertook the voluntary task of an interpreter between an English woman and 2 Italian officers. In that role, she spoke English and Italian interchangeably and did that so well that the English women thought Zeynep was an Italian and the 2 Italian men mistook her for an English woman. I'll now tell you about the production of Zeynep Hanoum's Turkish women's European impressions, in which she narrates her European, especially London experiences. At the beginning of their European trip, Zeynep and Malak met the British feminist and journalist called Grace Ellison, and they met her in France. And since then, they had regular contact and communicated mainly through letters for years, which resulted in the production of 3 books. Zeynep's Turkish Women's European Impressions. Malak's book is titled Abdul Hamid's Daughter, The Tragedy of an Ottoman Princess. And Grace Ellison's book is An English Woman in a Turkish Harem. All these 3 books were actually edited and produced by Grace Ellison. And Rainer Lewis calls a Turkish Women's European Impressions a composite text because it contains writings of 3 writers: Ellison's introduction and notes, 19 of Zeynep's letters, and 1 of Malak's. All the letters were sent to Ellison from various locations in Europe from 1906 to 1912. And now both the Zeynep and Atiya had Turkish connections, even though Atiya lived in Bombay and died in Karachi, but she had a family connection in Istanbul. Her father was a merchant, was a businessman. Her father, Hassan Ali, he lived in Istanbul for business purposes. And this is how Zeynep was born in, Atiya was born in Istanbul. And another interesting fact is that the Fyzee sisters, they used to wear Turkish style loose garment called charshaf. And they familiarized in India, and that became the Fyzee charshaf. It's actually a Turkish dress that became popular in India because of these Fyzee sisters. Now, generally in Orientalist literature, Muslim women are represented, are portrayed as cocooned, as secluded, or who are always at home, they never go out. But the travels of these 2 women tell us that Muslim women are not how they are presented in Orientalist literature. And Shibon Lambert Harley actually suggests that Muslim women cannot be cocoon in the house, because in Islam we have the concepts of Hajj, hijrah, and rihlah. And all these three practices, Hajj, hijrah, and rihlah, all of them require Muslims to go out in public. So without going out, no one can perform Hajj, hijrah, or rihlah. And all these three concepts are equally relevant to both Muslim men and women. And I would add one more Islamic concept that also suggests that Muslim women cannot remain cocoon in the domestic enclosure. The very practice of hijab indicates that Muslim women may need to go out and meet male strangers. And the concept of rihlah is very relevant to Atiya, because she went to London to attend a teacher training college called Maria Gray College, which was established in 1878 and has been part of Brunel University in 1976. So her journey to London can be regarded also as hijrah, in the sense of migration for education. And in Islam, we have this concept of rihla ilmiya, or educational tourism, or rihla fi talab al-ilm, that means traveling in search of knowledge. And this is an important aspect of Islam, because the Prophet said, one who leaves their home in search of knowledge remains on the path of God until they return. So it is in that spirit, many Muslim men and women, they went out in search of knowledge. And we see in Atiya's case, she went to London to attend a teacher's training college. And in the case of Zeyneb, she came from Turkey because she faced some restrictive conditions there. So her trip to Europe can be regarded as hijrah, even though she escaped a Muslim majority country, but she emigrated to safety. And hijrah means actually emigration to Dar al-Amn, or emigration to a place of safety, an abode of safety. Many Muslims actually have continued to make such hijrahs to the West to avoid oppression in their Muslim majority countries. All this show that in Muslim societies, traveling is not always a secular pursuit. So we cannot always describe traveling as a secular act. It is very much religious. And Muslims have been traveling as part of their religious obligation for Hajj, hijrah, or rihlah. Now, when Atiya and Zeyneb arrived in Europe, especially in London, that created huge curiosity among people, among the locals, because they had the Orientalist image of Muslim women. But when they found these women, they came over without their male relatives or family members, and there was a huge curiosity. And both Atiya and Zeyneb, they didn't like it. They thought that was unwarranted. And Zeyneb regards this kind of inquisitiveness as an unpleasant discovery. And she also regards it as kind of espionage. And she laments, alas, alas, there is no privacy inside or outside Turkey, because in Turkish, they faced espionage, or they faced surveillance by the police of Sultan Abdul Hamid. But when they came, when Zeyneb and Malek came over to London, they had the same kind of surveillance. People were excessively curious about these two Muslim women. Atiya and Zeyneb were courageous and confident in commenting on aspects of European society, and were treated as fantasies of astonishment and wonder in Europe. As colonial England viewed colonized Indians as backward and inferior, Atiya's unmistakable sophistication and elegance baffled the Londoners, and as a result, she was objectified as a symbol of visible difference. As Zeynep questioned the representation of Turkish women by Europeans, Atiya did that of Indians, and she said, until now, they had ungainly thoughts regarding Indians. If they meet an Indian who does not meet their fixed views, they become totally flabbergasted. I don't know at which level they place Indians in their minds, that everything surprises them. Now, London for Atiya and London for Zeynep were different. Atiya came to a London where there was a considerable uh, population from India, people from India. For example, wherever Atiya went, she found Indian students who came over for education. In one incident, she went to the University College London in 1907, and she said, whichever educational institution I go to, I always find some or other Indian girl. And when Atiya was in London, at that time, there was a strong Indian Students Association in Britain called National Indian Association. It was founded by Mary Carpenter and Keshav Chandra Sen, and they actually founded it to assist Indian students who came over from India for education. And also there was Cambridge Majlis at Cambridge University, which was established in 1891. And there was Oxford Majlis that was established in 1896. So all these, and later there was the India League that was established in 1928. So all these organizations suggest that the Indian students in Britain were organized, and that's why Zeynep actually didn't feel like she was in a completely foreign country. She felt like London was her second home. Conversely, there was no notable Turkish community in England at the time when Zeynep and her sister Malek visited the country. That's why, unlike Atiya, Zeynep did not benefit from a community of native people in London. Atiya's India was a British colony, but Zeynep's Turkey was a sovereign country. And this difference is also manifest in the way they describe London. Zeynep appears more independent, while Atiya sometimes seems to have been carrying a colonial baggage. Atiya's comments on London are mainly cultural, but Zeynep's more political and critical. For example, the suffrage or suffragette movement has remained something of an elephant in the room in Atiya's narrative. Atiya didn't touch on it at all, even though when she was in London, the suffrage movement was at its height. While Zeynep makes detailed comments on it, which I will discuss later in this talk. Now, both Atiya and Zeynep had huge admiration for London and Londoners. For example, Atiya said, how can London be described and how can it be imagined without seeing it? Oh, such streets, and what a grand city, and shops. It appears very nice when it is lit up at night. The way each shop is decorated is truly a skill. How much can a person see? People are models of fashion and get-up. God knows how these people are so accomplished. And similarly, Zeynep said, what a magnificent city London is. If you English are not proud of it, you ought to be. It seems to be as if English character were expressed even in the house of the people. Like ours in Turkey, the houses here are made for use, and their wide doors and wide passages seem to extend a welcome to you. And then both of them commented, no, not both of them, Atiya commented on the London Underground train service, or the tube, and she compared it to a jinn, as if a jinn coming and going underground. So she says, every moment this small railway comes and goes, and people are standing ready to board. If you delay, it's gone, to appear again in a few minutes, is the working of a jinn. Atiya was familiar with railway transportation because railways were established in India in her native city, Bombay, in 1853. But the underground was not there at that time in India. So that's why when she saw the London Underground, she was quite taken by a pleasant surprise. And while they talked about the public space in London, they also talked about the private space and the space of women in London. And Atiya says, it's a luxury to cook on an English stove and thus to keep a clean kitchen. If only food could be cooked in this way in India, it would be so convenient. And then she said, there is a maid here who cooks, waits at the table and cleans the house. Deliver hot water in the morning, take tea to every room, listen for knocking at the door at all times and answer it, tend the garden, clean the brass objects. One woman here does the same work as 6 servants in Bombay. And with all this service, the maid's cap and apron are spick and span, and I mean very neat and clean, and the hair is combed neatly. And then she says, truly, if this nation did not have these virtues, then half the world would not be in their control. They are really accomplished people. Actually, Atiya is over enthusiastic here and makes an extravagant claim. In fact, during the heyday of British colonialism, Britain had under its dominion approximately 1/4 of the world's land and governed around 1/5 of its population, not half of the world. And Ati, interestingly, talks about Islam and Londoners. She believes that many of the practices of the Londoners are Islamic. For example, she says, these people are so conscious of cleanliness. There is no trouble for them to observe the cleaning rules of us Muslim. To accept English ways in a Muslim manner is a simple, easy, and effortless task. Atiya is actually alluding to the Islamic concepts of tahara and nazafa. Tahara means physical cleanliness and nazafa is neatness. The Prophet Prophet Muhammad said, cleanliness is part of faith or half of faith. So she was linking this Islamic concept of cleanliness to how people in London lived their life in the early 20th century. And she says, in this country, the sea of learning flows from a force and in this country, the sea of learning flows with a force and many fortunate people benefit from it. It is true that only knowledge benefits human beings, honor in life and paradise in the life after, in the afterlife. It gives a rank in both worlds. May God make the light of learning shine again in our community, inshallah. So again, Atiya is making a connection between Islam's emphasis on knowledge and how London was a center of knowledge in the world at that time. And Atiya again said, many such people who have dedicated their lives to knowledge were gathered here. A marvelous group. I saw a new world, everyone immersed in competition and trying to outdo the others. I was amazed. Here, Atiya is perhaps talking about many Muslims who went to London for educational purposes. Like herself, her near contemporary Shahbanu Begum Maimuna Sultan, and their male contemporaries and prominent Muslim personalities from Britain, from British India, such as Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Abdul Qadir, Muhammad Iqbal, Mukhtar Ahmed Ansari, all of them traveled to Britain for educational purposes when Atiya was there. Among all the prominent Muslim intellectuals in England, in Zamana-i-Tahsil, Atiya pays the highest tribute to Abdullah Yusuf Ali for his scholarship, oratory, and immense influence among the literati and intellectuals of early 20th century London. Atiya's ability to correlate London's importance as a center of intellectual excellence and Islam's emphasis on knowledge shows her Islamic consciousness, and her ability to understand the religion in the context of her contemporary society. At times, Atiya seems overwhelmed by her admiration for the British and simplistic about her own country people. For example, once she attended an event in London where the speakers were talking about Indian Muslims. The British author and colonial administrator William Lee Warner was commenting on Indian Muslims, as Atiya puts it. Finding an opportunity, Mr. Lee Warner also spoke of how he lived in India and what he had observed there of the Muslims. There seemed to be no hope for their future progress and betterment. It's a slothful community. They don't know anything except the past, and so on. He spoke the truth. If we feel bad, that's our choice. Although there is some amount of truth in this statement, here Atiya seems to have missed the colonial element that contributed to the plight of Indian Muslims. But later, Atiya actually reconsidered her opinion in a speech titled Epic Women of India, which Atiya delivered during her trip in New York in 1918. She actually glorified India's past and summarily blamed its fall on the advent of British rule. So we need to also take into account her later comment on British colonialism. Interestingly, both of them talked about the Scotland Yard or the London Metropolitan Police Service. It may be comforting to the Met authorities to know Atiya's and Zeynep's admiration for the London Police Service, especially given the recent scandals and controversies in which they found themselves embroiled. Atiya and Zeynep hold in high regard the officers of London's Metropolitan Police Service. In commending London's excellent police system, Atiya narrates a story involving herself that happened in mid-November 1906. She was traveling in London by bus with her brother Ali Azhar and her good friend Catherine Firth, who was also a student of Maria Gray College that Atiya attended. On the bus, Atiya felt warm, took off her raincoat and put it next to her. However, when leaving the bus, she forgot to take her raincoat. Upon realizing this, after a few minutes, all three of them rushed back to the bus station where they had disembarked and discovered the bus had already departed. Then Catherine Firth reported it to the Lost Property Office at Scotland Yard. Amazingly, only a week later, Atiya received a letter from the police informing her that the raincoat was found and advising her to collect it. She was stunned by the carefulness, meticulousness, and professionalism of London's policing practices. While Atiya's experience with London police system was marked by her admiration for the diligence and professionalism of its personnel, Zeynep was struck by London police officers' cordiality and readiness to help, as well as by their honesty. She exclaims, "Whatever difficulty I have, they seem to be able to help me. And the most curious of all curious thing is they will not accept tips," another word for bribe. What wonderful man, and what a difference from our police in Constantinople, that is Istanbul. In Constantinople, I tremble almost at the sight of a policeman, but here I cannot imagine how I should do without them. The historian David Campion argues that colonial Britain maintained an egalitarian system of government at home in Britain, and its complete opposite in the colonies. It was simultaneously the world's leading liberal democracy at home and its largest autocratic state in colonial India, ruling one society by popular representation and consent, and the other by executive fiat and coercion. So that means the same colonial government had one system in Britain, and they had another system, an autocratic and totalitarian system in British India. Given the colonial relationship, the British young men who went to the colony to join the Indian Imperial Police held superior ranks and adopted a policing system marked by arrogance and condescension that was unlike anything that existed in the metropolis. Their policing in British India smack of abuse and arrogance toward the communities among whom they had patrolled. Like police forces in Sultan Abdul Hamid's Turkey, those in colonial India assumed the political role of surveillance and curtailment of civil liberties, which created an antagonism between them and those they policed. As regards the police in Britain, Atiya and Zeyneb noticed that the duty of maintaining public safety predominated. On the contrary, in India and Turkey, the main function of the policing system was to contain political dissent and suppress discontent. And this is perhaps still the situation in many countries in the world, that the police system is used for political purposes, not for public safety. In British India, it was busy silencing activist organizations in order to safeguard the interests and privileges of the colonial state. In Turkey at that time, the police service was spying and curtailing civil liberties, including freedom of expression. Now, interestingly, Zeynep discovered Harem in London, and that was a kind of epistemic revenge that she took. The most distinctive aspect of the harem typically highlighted is its gender exclusivity. For example, it's believed that harem is a place only for women, as it is often depicted as a single-sex sanctuary for women to which male access is restricted or forbidden. Zeynep discovered such female-only spaces in London. In an ironic turn of fate, Zeynep observed there was a harem in the British Parliament, as she cleverly and humorously wrote to Ellison, that means Grace Ellison. She said, "But my dear, why have you never told me that the ladies' gallery in British Parliament is a harem with its latticed windows, the harem of the government. No wonder the women cried through the windows of that harem that they wanted to be free. I felt inclined to shout out too. Is it in free England that you dare to have a harem? How inconsistent are you English? You send your women out unprotected all over the world, and here in the workshop where your laws are made, you cover them with a symbol of protection." By the way, when the British Parliament was rebuilt after the 1834 fire, the Victorian architect named Charles Barry created Ladies' Gallery in the new Palace of Westminster. It had windows covered with heavy metal grills, which made it difficult to see or hear, and it became both a physical and metaphorical symbol of women's exclusion from Parliament, and later a target of suffragette agitation. Zeynep's curious eyes discover another characteristic harem in London's University Club for Ladies that was established in 1887, and it was renamed as University Women's Club in 1921. According to Zeynep, a women-only club atmosphere is, after all, another kind of harem, and it has none of the mystery and charm of the harem of the East. Commenting on the harems in London, Zeynep seeks to prove that women all around the globe are subjected to restrictive measures. In her conversation with the British women, Zeynep told her the reason for her travel to various countries, and she said, "Like Diogenes, who tried to find a man, I have been trying to find a few women, but have not been successful." She refers to the Greek philosopher of the third century BC who pursued self-contentment and freedom from material needs. Diogenes wandered through the streets of ancient Athens in daylight with a lantern in his hand in search of an honest man, but he did not find one. Likewise, Zeynep was in search of free women and found none in Turkey or in Britain or anywhere else. She believes that women all the world over wage the same futile struggle for happiness. Atiya and Zeynep, both of them critique British women, while they had plenty of admiration for London and Londoners, but they also highlighted some negatives in the lifestyle of British London's women. Atiya describes a concert that she attended at the Royal Albert Hall in Kensington in London. The main attraction of the concert was the contralto singer Clara Butt. About Clara Butt's dress, Atiya says, God knows how she can bind herself and sing in such a constricted state, and that too with a smile. These people bear all kinds of tortures for the sake of appearance. As opposed to Clara Butt's dress, Atiya praises Fyzee charshaf, which is a complete simple outfit. Atiya maintained a sense of pride that she does not adopt an English cloak. She was persuaded by an Indian woman living in London to discard her badly tailored and tasteless gaudy English clothes and convinced her to continue wearing Indian clothes in Britain. Even though women in Turkey did not have the joys of freedom, they were spared many worries and pains and various stresses associated with public life. And this is why Zeyneb also talked about how women in London are actually prisoners of social life. And according to Zeyneb, British women appear to have made their social life the aim and object of their existence, and thus somewhat restricted their freedom, as they could not do what they felt they ought for fear of compromising a social position. Zeynep concludes that the life of Turkish women is mysterious and shrouded in shadows, while the life of British women is an open book which all can read who care. Zeynep's criticism of Turkish women is equally unflattering, as according to her, even though they had the time to devote to culture, they were unreasonably exacting. However, Zeynep is left in awe of British suffragettes, even though she was critical of ordinary women in London who were busy with their social life and their dress in public. But Zeynep had huge admiration for the suffragettes, and she praises them for their sense of purpose in life. Zeynep makes a distinction between the suffragettes and the ordinary sporting society women. Campaigns for women's right to vote in Britain actually began with John Stuart Mill's petition to Parliament in 1866. The movement ended in 1928 with the achievement of full adult suffrage. This long period saw the formation of various organizations and activities. In 1897, National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed. In 1903, Women's Social and Political Union was established, and this was an organization that promoted some kind of violent activities for the rights of women's vote. The movement for women's voting right took a violent turn in 1905 with the arrest of some activists like Annie Kenney and Christabel Pankhurst. And during all this time, Atiya was there in London, but Atiya didn't say a single word about the suffrage. But Zeynep made detailed comments about how the suffragettes were mistreated by the police in London. And Zeynep actually critiques both the police and also the suffragettes for their violent activities. But eventually she was sympathetic to the suffragettes, and she critiqued the government in Britain at that time that was torturing women in the streets. During Zeynep's visit to London, David Lloyd George was the Chancellor of Exchequer. He later became Prime Minister of Britain. And Zeynep talks about David Lloyd George a lot in the book. And he was a target of the suffragettes for his views against women's right to vote. What shocked Zeynep the most was that he was a politician of the Liberal Party, which later became Liberal Democrats in 1988. And she was shocked that a government of the Liberal Party could torture women in public in such manner. And Zeynep says to Grace Ellison, I cannot tell you the horrible impression it produces on the mind of a Turkish woman to learn that England not only imprisons, but tortures women. To me, it is the cataclysm of all my most cherished faith. It was the land of all lands I longed to visit, and now I hear a liberal government is torturing women. During Zeynep's time in London, newspapers were full of images of the crackdown on the suffragettes. For example, one media report showed that the police placed one imprisoned suffragette on the chair, forcing her into a slanting position, her head thrown back, while the 4 attendants each seized her arms and legs, stretching them to their full length so that her body took the form of a cross. So this kind of image actually shocked Zeynep. In their travel narratives, Zeynep and Atiya provide a frank assessment of their impression about London. Their admiration for the city and its people supersedes their criticism. That means they are actually more positive about London. Despite all her high regard from Britain and for the British, Atiya actually cannot even imagine liking this country enough to remain here forever. She could not accept London as her home. Equally, Zeynep also couldn't accept London as her, Britain as her home. And she said, it's a French word, déjà father, I left Turkey. Déjà chate, I have left Europe. That means I have left Turkey disenchanted, and I have left Europe disenchanted. That means I have been disappointed both in Turkey and in Europe. Atiya's and Zeynep's experiences in London can be explained by an anecdote Zeynep's Quran teacher told her. And this is how I want to conclude this session, that both of them visited Europe, especially London, and both of them were fascinated by the city, but eventually none of them could accept it as their home. And the story that Zeynep Hanoum narrates in the book is that an Anatolian girl, she used to believe everything that she hears. One day, from a window overlooking mountain ridges, she sees a mountainous chain that looks blue and exceptionally beautiful from far. And she was curious, and she wanted to enjoy the beauty of the mountainous chain that was far away from her. And she asked someone, how can she go and see the beauty of the mountain? And then she went up there, and she saw, when she reached the mountain peak, she found that that was simply the same grass that was available in her around her home. And then she made one trip after another, and she went from one mountain to another. Eventually she reaches the mountains of Altai in Central Asia, and then eventually she found that all the mountains are actually full of grasses, and the grasses are all available in her at her own place. But it was too late for her to understand that it was actually the distance that made the mountain so blue. It was not actually as beautiful as she saw from far. So what Atiya and Zeynep heard about Europe before visiting the continent had a romantic dimension. In their imagination, perhaps both saw European cities through their rose-tinted lenses and preconceived opinions. However, upon their arrival in Europe, especially London, while they see its glamour and splendors, much of their positive impression of the city is confirmed. They also notice the not so good side of the city. So this is how I want to conclude my presentation, that they had a romantic impression about London, but once they arrived there, they found both pros and cons of the city. Thank you very much, and I hope we will engage in more discussion. So if you have any questions, I will be happy to respond to those. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for that insightful discussion about the travels of Atiya and Zeynep. It has been really exciting, like, to learn about them and like, what they think about London and England as a whole. So we have a question here from one of our audience. She says that, does Zeynep say anything about the colonies of Turkey as compared to those of Britain? Both were colonial powers, but in Britain, we don't hear much from a Turkish point of view about how they regarded their own colonial practices.
Zeynep actually didn't talk about colonialism, but she talked about how the Turkish women were represented in European literature. And she was actually providing a counter narrative to the Orientalist literature that was quite widespread at that time. And there are many books written about Turkish women by European writers. By the time Zeynep arrived in London, there are dozens of books written about Turkish women, and all of them were negative. And Zeynep had that in mind, and when she visited Europe, she actually provided some kind of counter narrative, and she also talked about how in some cases Turkish women are much ahead of their European sisters. For example, in terms of multilingualism, she was surprised to see that Europeans are largely monolingual at that time. They do not know many languages. But in Turkey, most people are multilingual, even in the early 20th century. So in Zeynep's mind, the Orientalist portrayal of Turkish women was very prominent. She didn't talk much about British colonialism. Actually, we anticipated Atiya to talk about British colonialism because Atiya's British India was a British colonies, but unfortunately, she didn't talk about it. It seemed that at that age, she was full of admiration for the British. But as I said during my presentation, later she reconsidered her opinion and she had a negative perception of British colonialism.
Wonderful. So another one here is from Melissa, who's thanking you for your interesting talk. And she says she'll be grateful if you could repeat the titles of the books by Malek and the Englishwoman Ellis.
The Malek's book is a Turkish women's European impressions. And Grace Ellis's book is something Turkish Harem. I'll need to let me find it.
Okay.
Ellison, an English woman in a Turkish harem. Grace Ellison's book is An English Woman in a Turkish Harem. And Malek's book is Abdul Hamid's Daughter, The Tragedy of an Ottoman Princess.
So hope that answers your question, Melissa. So I think that are all the questions that we have to do. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for joining us and then giving this very insightful discussion about the lives of these two women. It has been very enlightening listening to you on this Sunday afternoon. And I also like to thank our attendees as well, both old and new, for joining us from as far as United States. Making the time to join us at like this very early in the morning at your time. So please join us for our next event, which will be celebrating the Arab Heritage Festival, which is going to be a week-long event of different activities, from the Arabic calligraphy workshop to the Arabic mushaira, to Arabic cuisine, and a lot more interesting activities. So please join us on the 10th of September from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. for the Arab Heritage Festival. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.